The thing about imperial ceremonies, Julian Terrace reflected while trying not to trip over his own feet, was that they seemed specifically designed to make everyone involved as uncomfortable as possible while pretending this was somehow an honor. He'd been standing in an antechamber for 45 minutes while court officials verified credentials he'd already provided 3 times, his formal diplomatic coat growing steadily more suffocating in the palace's precisely controlled atmosphere that felt about 5 degrees too warm for human comfort. The official who'd finally cleared him, a tall individual whose name Julian had immediately forgotten in the chaos of syllables, had thrust a data slate into his hands with the seating chart and disappeared before Julian could ask any clarifying questions. "Third circle, western quadrant. Look for your glyph marker," the official had said, which sounded straightforward until Julian actually entered the ceremonial hall and discovered that third circle apparently meant something different in high imperial geometry than it did in basic mathematics. The hall itself was a masterpiece of architecture that seemed to ignore several fundamental principles of structural engineering. Walls curved in impossible ways, meeting at angles that shouldn't exist, all of it glowing with soft bioluminescent light that pulsed in patterns that might have been decorative or might have been the building's equivalent of a heartbeat. Julian had stopped trying to understand alien aesthetic choices after the incident on Terrene Prime, where he'd complimented what he thought was a sculpture and turned out to be the ambassador's child. Other delegates were already seated, each one positioned with the precision of chess pieces arranged by someone who took the game far too seriously. Julian consulted his data slate, squinted at the row of glyphs carved into the floor markers, and immediately regretted not paying more attention during the cultural briefing where someone had probably explained how to distinguish between ceremonial script variations. The glyphs all looked essentially the same to his untrained eyes, flowing curves and accent marks that could have meant junior diplomatic observer or sacred guardian of the eternal flame, for all he could tell. He eliminated the options systematically. The first glyph had too many loops and was positioned in what was definitely the first circle, too close to the central dais for someone of his relatively junior status. The second glyph was in the fourth circle, which felt too far away and also had someone already sitting there looking very settled. That left 2 possibilities in what might have been the second or third circle, depending on whether you counted from the center outward or from the walls inward, a distinction the briefing materials had somehow failed to clarify. Julian made an executive decision based on the advanced diplomatic principle of close enough probably won't cause an interstellar incident, and sat down in the seat marked by the glyph that had slightly fewer accent marks. The seat was surprisingly comfortable, some kind of adaptive material that adjusted to his frame, and it offered an excellent view of the central dais where the Queen would presumably make her appearance. Around him, other delegates were engaged in the pre-ceremony ritual of looking important while doing nothing, a skill Julian had observed across a dozen species and concluded was probably hardwired into any sufficiently complex civilization. Nobody immediately told him he'd made a catastrophic error, which Julian took as confirmation that he was at least in the general vicinity of where he was supposed to be. He settled in, preparing for what would probably be 2 hours of speeches he wouldn't understand, followed by a reception where he'd make small talk about trade agreements and cultural exchange, while mentally composing his resignation letter. He'd been doing this job for 3 years and had yet to attend a diplomatic function that couldn't have been replaced with a simple message saying, "We acknowledge your existence and promise not to shoot at you this fiscal quarter." The ceremony began with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a harmonic tone that made Julian's molars ache and his inner ear complain about frequencies it hadn't evolved to process. Around him, the alien delegates responded with expressions of reverence, some touching their hands to their chests in gestures that probably meant something significant in their culture. The lights dimmed in a way that suggested someone had spent considerable time programming the perfect dramatic effect. And then the Queen entered, and Julian realized with the kind of clarity that usually preceded very bad decisions that something had gone terribly wrong with his seating arrangements. Every single person in the hall, and he meant every single person, all 200 or so delegates, guards, and officials, turned to look not at the Queen processing down the central aisle in robes that seemed to shift colors as she moved, but directly at him. The attention was like a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders with the combined force of several hundred alien stares that ranged from shock to horrified to, in one case, what might have been suppressed amusement. Julian did some rapid mental recalculation and arrived at several conclusions simultaneously. First, that he had not sat in the seat designated for junior human liaisons. Second, that the seat he had chosen was apparently significant in ways that transcended simple protocol violation. And third, that he was about to become a cautionary tale told to junior diplomats for the next several decades. He started to stand, preparing an apology that would hopefully convey sincere regret without admitting to the kind of incompetence that got people reassigned to monitoring ice planets in uninhabited systems. The Queen reached his position before he could fully execute his escape plan. She was younger than he'd expected, though Julian had no reference for how this species aged, with features that managed to convey both authority and something that might have been curiosity. Her ears rose in elegant points that reminded him vaguely of ancient Earth mythology, and her eyes, larger than human standard, with irises that shifted between amber and gold depending on the light, fixed on him with an intensity that made him forget whatever apology he'd been formulating. She sat down. More specifically, she sat down in the seat immediately adjacent to his, the one he should have recognized as reserved for someone far more important than a junior liaison who couldn't read ceremonial glyphs. And then, while the entire hall held its collective breath, and Julian's brain attempted to process what was happening, she reached over and placed her hand on top of his. The contact was warm, her skin carrying a texture slightly different from human, and Julian froze completely because he had absolutely no framework for understanding what was happening. Around them, the barely controlled chaos of the hall escalated from shocked whispers to what sounded like several advisors having simultaneous small crises. Guards had moved their hands to weapons, though they seemed uncertain whether they should be protecting the Queen from him or protecting him from immediate execution for protocol violation. The Queen ignored all of it. Her attention remained focused entirely on Julian, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear, carrying an accent that suggested standard wasn't her first language, but that she'd taken considerable care to master it anyway. "Stay," she said, and Julian felt the words settle into his chest like an anchor dropped into deep water. Sesseth had been queen for 8 years, which meant she'd survived approximately 3,000 formal functions, one serious assassination attempt, and countless minor plots that ranged from inconvenient to occasionally creative. She considered herself reasonably skilled at reading situations quickly and adjusting her response accordingly. The human sitting frozen beside her, radiating confusion and barely suppressed panic, required exactly the kind of quick adjustment she'd spent years perfecting. She could feel the hall's attention, like static electricity, could sense her advisors moving into crisis management mode, could practically hear her chief of protocol having what the humans called a breakdown. Good. She'd been planning this moment for weeks, had been waiting for the right opportunity to make a statement that couldn't be ignored or explained away through careful diplomatic language. The human's seating error had provided that opportunity far more elegantly than anything she could have orchestrated. "Your Majesty," her primary advisor, Kellis, whispered urgently from 3 seats away. "Protocol requires—" "Protocol," Sesseth interrupted, still speaking quietly, but with enough edge that Kellis stopped mid-sentence. "Is about to be revised. Pay attention." She kept her hand on the humans. Julian Terrace, she recalled from the briefing materials she'd actually read unlike most of her court, and felt his pulse hammering against her palm. He hadn't moved since she'd told him to stay, which showed either admirable discipline or complete paralysis, probably both. Around them, the hall had descended into barely controlled chaos, delegates whispering to each other in a dozen languages, guards uncertain whether this constituted an emergency requiring intervention. Sesseth stood, bringing Julian up with her through simple pressure on his hand, and addressed the assembly in High Imperial with the voice she reserved for declarations that weren't open to debate. "Members of the court, honored delegates, witnesses to this assembly. You observe what appears to be a violation of protocol. I assure you, it is not. It is a correction." The whisper stopped. When the Queen used that particular formal register, you listened or you found yourself explaining your lack of attention to people who took protocol violations very seriously. Seseth continued, knowing she had perhaps 90 seconds before someone worked up the courage to object publicly. Weeks ago, this human submitted an analysis regarding our proposed resolution to the Coral border dispute. His recommendations contradicted our initial position. They were inconvenient, uncomfortable, and would have required substantially more effort to implement than our preferred solution. They were also correct. She paused, letting that sink in. Because of his analysis, we modified our approach. 40,000 civilians were not displaced. A solution was found that honored both legal frameworks and basic decency. The outcome was better for all parties, though it required more work from us. She could see her court doing the political calculations, trying to figure out where this was going and how to position themselves accordingly. Julian had stopped trying to escape and was now just standing very still, which Seseth appreciated. Running would have ruined the effect. In our tradition, she continued, switching to standards so the human delegations could follow without translation delays, those who sit in the second circle, closest to the throne, are those whose counsel shapes decisions. For too long, that proximity has been determined by political necessity rather than quality of thought. Today, through accident or providence, I leave that distinction to those who care about such things. We have an opportunity to correct that imbalance. She released Julian's hand and turned to face him directly, speaking clearly enough that the entire hall could hear. Julian Terrace, you did not seek this position. You arrived expecting a minor ceremonial role and made what you believed was a simple mistake in reading glyphs you were never properly taught to interpret. But your presence here, in the seat traditionally reserved for the sovereign's closest advisor, provides a chance to demonstrate what I value in counsel. You were willing to argue against an easy resolution when you believed the cost was too high. That quality belongs at the center, not relegated to the margins where it can be conveniently ignored. Julian found his voice, though it came out slightly rougher than normal. Your Majesty, I'm not qualified to... You're qualified to speak uncomfortable truths. That's a rarer qualification than most of the credentials represented in this hall. Seseth allowed herself a slight smile. Also, you accidentally sat in the correct seat for someone fulfilling that function, which suggests either remarkable intuition or spectacular luck. Either way, I'm inclined to accept it as valid. Her chief of protocol, a severe individual named Torith, who'd been managing ceremonial functions for 4 decades, stepped forward with the kind of careful determination that suggested he was about to object strenuously while remaining technically respectful. Your Majesty, the traditional role you describe requires specific cultural knowledge, understanding of our legal frameworks, and what, Torith? The ability to tell me what I want to hear in 14 different formal registers? We have plenty of that. What we lack are people willing to argue for better solutions when our preferred approaches are insufficient. Seseth kept her tone light but firm. The human stays. If his lack of cultural knowledge is a problem, we'll teach him. Consider it an opportunity for genuine cultural exchange rather than the performative kind we usually engage in. She could see Julian processing this, see him working through the implications and probably arriving at the conclusion that his quiet career in low-level diplomatic observation had just become significantly more complicated. To his credit, he didn't panic visibly. He just stood there looking like someone who'd stumbled into a situation well beyond his expertise and was trying to figure out the least catastrophic response. I appreciate the confidence, Julian said carefully, but I should mention that my superiors will probably have opinions about this arrangement. I imagine they will. Those opinions can be addressed through normal diplomatic channels. Seseth gestured toward the assembly. For now, the ceremony continues. You may sit or stand as you prefer, but understand that your position has changed. You came as an observer. You leave as an advisor, assuming you choose to accept the role. And if I don't? Then you walk away, and we pretend this was an amusing anecdote about cross-cultural misunderstanding. But I think you won't. She met his eyes. Because you wrote that analysis knowing it would probably be ignored. You did it anyway because the alternative was staying silent when you saw a problem. People who make those choices don't usually walk away when offered the chance to make those choices matter. Julian was quiet for a moment, and Seseth could practically see him working through the decision tree. Around them, the court waited with varying degrees of patience and concern. Finally, he nodded slightly. I'll stay, though I'm going to need extensive help with those ceremonial glyphs. Consider help arranged. Sesseth returned to her seat, satisfied. Now, shall we complete the ceremony? I believe there are approximately 90 minutes of speeches scheduled, and we wouldn't want to deprive everyone of that experience. Julian sat down beside her, and the ceremony proceeded with the kind of rigid formality that suggested everyone involved was desperately trying to pretend the last 10 minutes hadn't completely rewritten the political calculus. Sesseth listened to the speeches with half her attention, while using the other half to consider the implications of what she'd just done. She'd elevated a junior human liaison to a position of genuine influence based on a seating error and a dissenting opinion, had publicly declared that proximity to power should be determined by quality of conscience rather than political maneuvering. Her advisors would complain. The traditionalists would object. And absolutely none of that mattered compared to the message she'd just sent to every delegate in the hall. Speak uncomfortable truths and be heard, or stay silent and remain irrelevant. Beside her, Julian sat with the posture of someone trying very hard to look like they belonged while internally screaming, and Sesseth allowed herself a moment of genuine amusement. The universe had a peculiar sense of timing, delivering exactly the opportunity she'd needed in the form of a human who couldn't read ceremonial glyphs and hadn't known enough to avoid the seat that would change his life. The speeches were exactly as interminable as Julian had feared, though now he was listening with the acute awareness of someone whose professional status had just been dramatically upgraded without his input or consent. The speaker, some high-ranking official whose title translated roughly to Keeper of Historical Precedents, was explaining in exhaustive detail the significance of the ceremony's traditional elements. And Julian was trying very hard to look engaged while his brain processed the fact that he'd accidentally become an imperial advisor through a combination of bad glyph interpretation and one dissenting opinion he'd written 3 months ago. Beside him, the Queen sat with perfect posture that somehow managed to look comfortable, her attention apparently focused on the speeches, though Julian suspected she was as bored as he was and simply better at hiding it. Every few minutes, someone in the audience would glance in their direction, and Julian would remember that he was sitting in the most visible position in the entire hall, elevated to a status he absolutely had not earned through any normal diplomatic progression. When the speeches finally concluded and the ceremonial elements wound down to the reception phase, Julian found himself immediately surrounded by advisors who'd apparently drawn lots to determine who had to deal with the human problem first. The winner, or possibly loser, was Kellis, the Queen's primary advisor who'd tried to object earlier and been smoothly shut down. Liaison Terrace, Kellis said with the kind of forced politeness that suggested she was deeply unhappy about this entire situation. Perhaps we should discuss the practicalities of your new position. I'm very open to practicalities, Julian replied, especially the practical question of what exactly my new position entails beyond sitting in expensive seats and looking confused. The Queen has elevated you to the Inner Council, which traditionally advises on matters of policy, cultural affairs, and strategic decision-making. It's a position normally held by individuals with decades of experience in imperial governance. And I have 3 years of experience in filing reports that nobody reads. I can see how those qualifications align perfectly. Kellis's expression suggested she appreciated his self-awareness, even if she didn't appreciate his presence. Your lack of experience could actually be valuable. The Queen seems to believe that fresh perspectives outweigh traditional expertise, at least in your specific case. Because I wrote one report saying maybe we shouldn't displace 40,000 people for administrative convenience. Because you wrote that report knowing it would likely be ignored, and you wrote it anyway. That apparently qualifies as rare courage in the Queen's assessment. Kellis paused. For what it's worth, I read your analysis. It was thorough, well-reasoned, and correctly identified flaws in our initial approach that we'd overlooked because we were focused on legal justification rather than practical outcomes. Thank you, I think. Don't let it inflate your ego too much. You're going to make mistakes, probably spectacularly embarrassing ones, and I'll be there to watch you fumble through learning protocols you should have mastered before accepting this position. I didn't exactly accept. I got volunteered through accidental seating. And then you chose to stay when given the option to leave. That was acceptance. Kellis gestured toward a side chamber where other advisors were gathering. Come, we need to brief you on approximately 800 years of precedent you're now expected to navigate, and we have about 20 minutes before the reception starts and people begin asking you policy questions you're completely unprepared to answer. The briefing was less helpful than Julian had hoped and more overwhelming than he'd feared. The inner council apparently advised on everything from trade agreements to cultural preservation to military positioning, which meant Julian had just become responsible for having informed opinions on subjects he'd barely thought about during his previous role of attending ceremonies and filing reports. The advisors explained the formal hierarchies, the informal power structures, the ancient rivalries that still influence current politics, and the 17 different ways to accidentally insult someone through improper use of honorifics. "This is insane," Julian said after the 10th minute of explanation about precedence rules. "I can't possibly learn all of this in time to be useful." "You're not expected to know everything immediately," said Torith, the chief of protocol who'd objected to Julian's elevation and seemed to have decided that if he was stuck with an incompetent human advisor, he might as well try to make him slightly less incompetent. "You're expected to ask questions, defer to expertise when appropriate, and contribute perspective that those of us embedded in imperial culture might overlook. So I'm the designated outsider who asks stupid questions and occasionally notices things everyone else missed?" "Essentially, yes, though we'd prefer you phrase it more diplomatically when describing your role to others." The reception began with all the enthusiasm of a gathering where everyone was still processing the earlier protocol disruption and trying to figure out how to respond. Julian found himself approached by delegates from a dozen species, each one carefully probing to understand what his new position meant for their own diplomatic standing. He deflected most questions with variations of, "I'm still learning the specifics," and "You'd need to discuss that with the Queen's office," which seemed to satisfy people while committing him to absolutely nothing. The Queen appeared beside him with the kind of perfect timing that suggested she'd been watching from across the room and had decided he needed rescuing. "How are you managing the attention?" "I'm employing the ancient diplomatic technique of saying nothing useful while sounding engaged. It's going surprisingly well." "Good instinct. Most of these conversations are people trying to determine if you're an asset they can cultivate or a problem they need to manage. Best to remain ambiguous until you understand the landscape better." She accepted a drink from a passing server, something luminescent that probably wasn't safe for human consumption. "Kellis tells me you're overwhelmed by the briefings." "Kellis is being generous. I'm catastrophically underprepared for this role." "Everyone is catastrophically underprepared for roles they didn't seek. The difference is whether you're willing to learn fast enough to become useful before you cause too much damage." The Queen smiled slightly. "I'm betting you will. That analysis you wrote showed capacity for systems thinking and willingness to challenge assumptions. Those qualities are more valuable than knowing which honorific to use when addressing the subdirector of agricultural policy." "I appreciate the confidence, though I should mention that my superiors are probably going to object to this arrangement." Loudly. "They've already objected, loudly. I received 3 urgent communications in the last hour requesting clarification of your new role and suggesting it might be premature to elevate you to the inner council." The Queen's expression suggested she'd enjoyed those communications. "I replied that your elevation was based on demonstrated merit and that if they had concerns about your qualifications, they should perhaps have noticed your analytical capabilities earlier instead of filing your work without reading it." Julian winced. "That's going to make my next performance review interesting. Consider it an opportunity to request a transfer to permanent imperial service. Your current position is technically a short-term diplomatic posting. We could formalize something more permanent if you're interested." "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a role where your work might actually matter instead of disappearing into bureaucratic archives. Whether that constitutes a job or a burden depends on your perspective." She paused. "Think about it. You don't need to decide immediately." The reception continued for another hour, and Julian navigated conversations with the cautious precision of someone walking through a minefield while wearing a blindfold. By the time he finally escaped back to his quarters, he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with maintaining diplomatic composure, while his entire professional life restructured itself around a seating error. He sat on the edge of his bed, actual bed, not the adaptive sleeping pod he'd been using, because apparently inner council advisors rated proper furniture and considered his options. He could decline the position, return to his previous role, and spend the rest of his career as a cautionary tale about reading ceremonial glyphs properly, or he could accept that sometimes history pivoted on accidents and see where this unexpected opportunity led. His comm unit chimed with a message from his supervisor. "Terrace, what the hell just happened? Call immediately." Julian stared at the message, then deleted it and composed a different one addressed to the Queen's office. "Regarding your earlier offer of permanent Imperial service, I'm interested in discussing terms." He sent it before he could reconsider, lay back on the bed, and laughed at the absurdity of a universe where you could become an advisor to an alien empire because you sat in the wrong seat and once wrote a report nobody was supposed to read. The integration process took 3 weeks and involved more briefings than Julian had experienced during his entire diplomatic training. He learned the 17 formal registers of High Imperial Address, though he suspected he'd spend years before using them correctly. He studied the historical precedents that governed inner council decisions, memorizing case law that dated back to before humans had left their home system. He attended policy meetings where he contributed exactly nothing but absorbed the patterns of debate and decision-making that characterized imperial governance. Kellis had appointed herself his primary mentor, which Julian suspected was less about genuine support and more about damage control. She walked him through the informal power structures that mattered more than official hierarchies, explained which advisors could be trusted and which ones would smile while undermining your position, and corrected his mistakes before they became public embarrassments. "You're learning faster than I expected," she admitted after Julian successfully navigated a 3-hour policy debate about trade route security without saying anything catastrophically stupid. "Most humans struggle with the nuance of imperial decision-making. I'm motivated by terror of public failure. It's remarkably effective as a learning incentive." "Good. Maintain that terror. The moment you become confident is the moment you'll make mistakes that matter." The Queen had been less visible during his integration, which Julian understood was deliberate. She'd made her statement by elevating him. Now he needed to prove he deserved the position through actual work rather than royal patronage. When she did attend council meetings, she listened more than she spoke, and Julian noticed she often looked to him when discussions became too comfortable, too focused on maintaining existing approaches rather than questioning assumptions. His first real contribution came during a debate about resource allocation for border colonies. The discussion had calcified around 2 positions: increase security presence or maintain current levels and redirect resources to core world development. Julian listened for 40 minutes before raising his hand in the gesture Kellis had taught him meant permission to speak as junior member. The Queen nodded permission, and Julian took a breath before committing to an opinion that would either validate his presence or confirm he had no business being there. What if the question isn't binary? The border colonies need security, but they also need infrastructure that makes them worth defending. Currently, we're debating whether to protect empty territory or abandon it to focus on established areas. Maybe the answer is smaller security presence paired with accelerated development, making the colonies valuable enough that both we and the colonists are invested in their defense. The silence that followed lasted approximately 5 seconds, which felt like an hour. Then Torith, who'd been arguing for maintaining current security levels, leaned back with an expression that might have been annoyance or might have been grudging respect. "That would require coordinating 3 different administrative departments that traditionally don't cooperate well." "Yes," Julian agreed. "It would also require acknowledging that our current approach isn't working and that maybe the border colonies deserve better than being treated as either military assets or acceptable losses." More silence. Then the Queen spoke, her voice carrying the tone she used when making decisions that would be recorded in official minutes. "Prepare a detailed proposal incorporating Advisor Terrace's suggestion. Cross-departmental cooperation can be mandated if the outcome justifies the administrative complexity. Next meeting will review specifics." The debate moved on, but Julian caught Kellis's slight nod of approval and realized he'd just passed some kind of test. After the meeting, several advisors approached him with variations of "interesting perspective" and "hadn't considered that angle," which Julian interpreted as political language for maybe the human isn't completely useless. The queen found him afterward in one of the palace gardens, a space that achieved the impossible by looking both carefully designed and naturally wild. She was examining something that might have been a flower or might have been a small architectural feature. Julian still couldn't always tell the difference. "You did well in there," she said without looking up from her examination. "I suggested something that will create massive administrative headaches. I'm not sure that qualifies as doing well. You suggested something that might actually solve a problem instead of managing it into perpetual stalemate. That qualifies as exactly what I elevated you to do." She straightened. "The border colonies have been caught between competing priorities for a decade. Everyone knows the current approach is insufficient, but changing it requires someone willing to state the obvious and propose solutions that aren't politically convenient. So I'm the person who says inconvenient things. You're the person who notices when convenient answers aren't adequate. There's a difference." The queen started walking along the garden path, and Julian fell into step beside her. "3 weeks ago, you were a junior liaison filing reports nobody read. Now you're influencing resource allocation for an entire imperial sector. How does that feel?" "Terrifying and completely surreal. Also like I'm going to make catastrophic mistakes that harm people who deserve better." "Good. That fear will keep you careful. The advisors I worry about are the ones who become comfortable with their own expertise, who've stopped questioning whether their confident decisions might be wrong." She paused at a junction in the path. "Your proposal will face resistance. Some of it legitimate concern about implementation challenges, some of it political maneuvering by people who benefit from the current approach. You'll need to defend your position without becoming defensive, adjust to valid criticism without abandoning core principles. Any advice on how to do that? Listen more than you speak. When you do speak, focus on outcomes rather than defending your ego. And remember that changing minds takes time. You're arguing against years of established approach. That doesn't shift in a single meeting." She smiled slightly. "Though you made a good start." Over the following weeks, Julian's proposal evolved through 6 iterations, incorporating feedback from department heads, colonial representatives, and advisors who'd initially opposed the approach, but found elements they could support. The final version looked substantially different from his initial suggestion, refined through compromise and practical consideration. But the core principle remained, that protecting territory required making it worth protecting. The vote to approve implementation passed with a narrow majority, and Julian watched several advisors who'd initially dismissed his presence, now treating him as someone whose opinions required actual consideration rather than polite dismissal. He'd proven he could contribute, could navigate imperial politics without completely embarrassing himself, could hold his position without being crushed by advisors with decades more experience. His supervisor finally caught up with him via secure communication, and the conversation was exactly as uncomfortable as Julian had anticipated. There were accusations of abandoning his diplomatic posting, concerns about divided loyalties, questions about his long-term career trajectory that Julian couldn't answer because he honestly didn't know. "You understand this makes you essentially unemployable in normal diplomatic service," his supervisor said. "You've positioned yourself as someone who operates outside standard hierarchies. That's useful until it isn't, and then you're isolated with nowhere to fall back on. I'm aware of the risks. I'm choosing to accept them. Because an alien queen told you that you were special? Because I'm doing work that matters instead of filing reports that disappear. If that makes me unemployable in normal diplomatic service, I can live with that." Julian paused. "I'm formally requesting transfer to permanent imperial service. You'll have the paperwork by end of day." The call ended badly, which Julian had expected. He'd burned bridges with his home government in exchange for a position that didn't exist 3 weeks ago, all because he'd sat in the wrong seat and an alien monarch had decided that mistake meant something. It should have felt reckless. Instead, it felt like the first decision in his career that he'd made for the right reasons instead of the safe ones. The Queen found him later in the council chambers, reviewing economic reports that would inform the border colony implementation. She didn't say anything, just sat in the adjacent seat, the one that had started this entire situation, and waited. "I transferred," Julian said finally. "Made it official. No going back to comfortable obscurity. Having second thoughts?" "Constantly. but also knowing I'd have worse thoughts if I'd walked away. That's called integrity. It's uncomfortable, but tends to age well. She stood. Come. There's a reception for the colonial representatives who'll be implementing your proposal. They'll want to meet the advisor who completely restructured their resource allocation, and you'll want to hear their concerns before implementation begins. Julian followed her toward yet another diplomatic function, this one carrying weight because it represented actual change rather than ceremonial theater. He'd arrived at the palace 3 weeks ago expecting routine formality and had left having accidentally stumbled into significance through a seating error and one dissenting opinion. The universe, he reflected, had a peculiar sense of narrative timing, and sometimes the most important decisions were the ones you made when someone gave you permission to leave, but you chose to stay instead.